From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead today, K-State's Gregg Hanzlicek will discuss the circumstances that lead to winter tetany in mature beef cows, an often lethal condition that turns up around calving time. He'll cover how this magnesium deficiency can occur and what you cow-calf producers can do proactively to avoid cow losses to this tetany condition. Then K-State's Jisang Yu and Gyuhyeong Goh will talk about a novel approach that they've developed for gauging the direct relationship of temperature extremes to crop production losses. And later on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton concludes his look at the steps to starting vegetable garden transplants from seed. All that coming up on Agriculture Today. This is our Thursday edition of Agriculture Today, and we're glad to have you aboard as we wander once again into the area of bovine health management and welcome in from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State, the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit with that lab, Gregg Hanzlicek. He's with us monthly right here. Gregg, as we approach spring calving time for so many of our cow herds around Kansas, what you have to share today is very appropriate to that. It's a condition that's called winter tetany in the cow herd. Now, we're familiar with another form of tetany often spoken about. This is similar but different, you say.
Yep, and that term that a lot of producers have heard about is grass tetany. The medical term is hypomagnesemia, which just means there's not a sufficient amount of magnesium in the blood. And they're both very, very similar. They're caused by the same things, but winter tetany is something we're going to see in late gestation, early lactation beef cows in the spring around Kansas in the Midwest, basically.
And it's not a minor thing in that it can lead to cow losses.
Absolutely. The classical sign are what producers would say sudden death, and it's always in the older animals. We're not going to see it in yearlings or calves typically, or even 2-year-olds. But older cows where they feed them at night, they come back the next morning and there's one or more dead. That's a typical classical sign. Sometimes if they're observed early in the course of the hypomagnesemia, they'll be to the point where they can't walk, they're stumbling, and some will even be down where they're still aware but they can't get up. So those are the classical signs for this disease.
Well, what's at the root of this? You say that the animal itself typically stores a certain level of magnesium?
Absolutely. The cow does a really good job of storing magnesium, primarily in the bones, some in the teeth, some in the muscle. But the downside is that the cow has no mechanism. Once the blood level gets to a low point, they have no mechanism to draw magnesium out of the muscle or the bones. And so they're almost totally dependent on keeping their blood levels of magnesium at a good level by what they eat every day. And that's what happens is their intakes aren't what they should be, and so then we see the classical signs of magnesium.
Is there a certain level of magnesium that a cow must have access to on a given day? Is there a benchmark there, so to say?
Well, there is in the forages, and when we look at forages, if we see a magnesium level of less than 0.18%, then that gives us an idea that this animal, if she's not getting supplemental magnesium, this herd is going to be at a high risk of winter tetany.
So when we look at the factors that you say lead to this condition, forage is low in magnesium would be the starting point there.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of other things. So low magnesium forage, and just like in grass tetany, elevated potassium is the real big driver. And elevated potassium in the diet prevents the cow from absorbing the magnesium from the diet through the rumen wall. And so we've got low magnesium forages and or high potassium forages. Salt, sodium is very, very important to maintain magnesium levels appropriately in the body. So animals that don't have access to salt is important. Animals on a high forage diet are more predisposed than animals on a high concentrate diet. Well, that's what we're feeding our cows in the wintertime is high forage diets. And then something that we've investigated in the diagnostic lab and through the years is sometimes everything's okay, and we even have a mineral that has an appropriate level of magnesium in it, but the magnesium oxide in the mineral's at a very poor quality. and those cows aren't absorbing the magnesium from the mineral. So all of those things, one or more of those things, all contribute to our dead cows and down cows in the wintertime.
It's a bad situation when it happens. If, in fact, one comes upon an animal that's still alive but hanging on, can this be treated and can they recover from that condition?
Absolutely. So if we've got a cow that can't get up and she is late gestation or lactation, that's one of the things that should be put at the top of the list is she needs magnesium. The thing to do is call the local veterinarian, and it's going to require intravenous solution of magnesium, calcium, and phosphorus. And the vast majority, if they're still laying on their sternum, will get up immediately after the treatment, and everything will be good. Wow. I'm going to put a little caveat here. Sometimes our hypomagnesiemic cows can become very belligerent. And so when we talk about it, especially as veterinarians, when we're finished IVing those cows, we want to have an escape route because they will a lot of times get up immediately and they'll be on the fight. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, treatment, if they're down on their side, maybe not so successful, but if they're on their sternum, very successful treatment.
If one is not timely, though, and the cow succumbs to this, would a full diagnosis be worthwhile here?
Absolutely. A dead cow found overnight or during the day, just what we call sudden death. It is important for the local veterinarian to post or necropsy that cow to make sure there's not other disease processes, infectious disease processes. The downside of the hypomagnesemia is that when they do the necropsy, there really isn't any definitive sign that says that's what it is. They're going to have to do other testing to prove or disprove that it's magnesium.
So in that process, what are they looking at? What components?
Well, surprisingly, the best sample to determine the magnesium level of a deceased cow is the fluid that's in the eye. And if they take that, send it into our diagnostic laboratory, we can run calcium, magnesium, and potassium and see what those levels are if that sample was collected within 48 hours after death. And if the magnesium is low, or the calcium is low, or both, then we've got a for sure diagnosis on this animal.
Something that should be looked at as well, what that animal actually consumed, and that the forage intake might be, as you said, a factor?
Diet's always an important factor, so we like to, at least through a computer program, decide what the ration looks like. But it's even better to take some samples and say, okay, let's look at it. Let's determine how much potassium, how much magnesium is in the diet. So, yeah, it's what are they eating, and then let's take some ocular fluid to see whether they're hypomagnesemic.
So that's the worst-case scenario if the animal has already succumbed to winter tetany. Of course, we're always looking for preventative measures here, Greg, and there may be some things to consider there for our producers as we move forward into late gestation, early lactation.
Yep, so we always go back to let's look at the diet. So test the forages and the normal things, the proteins and all that, but make sure the forage is tested for calcium, magnesium, potassium, and then make sure that there's an appropriate amount of magnesium in the diet. If the forages will not provide that, and like I said, forages under 0.18% magnesium probably aren't, then it's appropriate to provide a high magnesium mineral for the cows. And when we talk high mag, we're talking 10 to 13% magnesium in that mineral.
There's another tactic here that you call a tetany ratio, running that. What's that about?
Well, so a nutritionist or veterinarian can calculate what's called the tetany ratio, which is a comparison of the potassium level to the levels of both the magnesium and the calcium. And when it gets up to 2.2 or higher, then the herd, the diet, and everything is at a high risk of hypomagnesemia. So that's another tool that's cheap and available. And you just use the numbers right off your forage analysis, so you don't have to do any other testing or spend any more money.
And again, this would be worthwhile as soon in advance as you could, any time before calving time?
I would. You can do this for just some dollars, a few dollars. I would have the forages tested, and then a producer could calculate it. Anybody can calculate this, and if it's under the 2, you probably don't have to worry about it. If it's over 2, then for sure you're going to have to figure out a way to get some more magnesium in these animals.
But it sounds like at the real core of this is assuring a balanced ration that has the proper levels of magnesium as well as everything else that needs to go into that, with that cow's nutritional levels reaching an apex here heading into calving time. But that's the real key to this.
Absolutely. And if the forages are low with magnesium or high in potassium, what producers are really left with just making sure that there's a high mag mineral, 10 to 13% magnesium, high-quality magnesium oxide in the mineral, and there's a way to determine that. But I also always like to remind producers that anything free choice, especially a dry free choice like a mineral, you're going to have about 15%, up to 15% of the cows will never touch that. So the mineral is something a producer has to do, but if they're going to offer a free choice, it may not satisfy all the cows in the herd.
Yeah. As we finish out here, one of the things just to keep in mind is that this is not singular to any individual in the herd. The entire herd could be exposed to this if one doesn't take precautions and check things out.
Absolutely, and there's been some really good research because they deal with this problem a lot more over in Ireland and England and those places where if we have an animal that's down and dead from hypomagnesemia, it's probably a herd problem. That doesn't mean the whole herd is going to show clinical signs. We don't understand why some animals, even though they're hypomagnesiemic, do not show clinical signs, but it needs to be addressed as a herd disease, not an individual cow disease.
And have that conversation, producers, with your herd nutritionist, with your veterinarian. You want to avoid incidents of winter tetany in cows, once again, as they head down the home stretch of gestation and eventually head into calving time and that lactation period. Gregg, thank you, as always.
My pleasure.
From the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State, that's Gregg Hanzlicek on this part of Agriculture Today. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. And our next conversation falls in the realm of an interest that's ongoing not only in agriculture but across the spectrum of society, warming climate and the climatic conditions that would impact crop losses and ultimately food production practices. Our guests now have just conducted an interesting analysis of those impacts and a rather involved process that they took on. Joining us from the Department of Agricultural Economics here at K-State, Jisang Yu, and from the Department of Statistics here at the university, Gyuhyeong Goh. They were the principals in this work. Jisang, welcome back. We've had you here before. Gyuhyeong, it's your first time to visit with us. But to Jisang, what is this new study all about? It has to do with crops not common in Kansas, but with possible application to our more regularly grown crops in the state.
Well, thanks, Eric, for having me back here. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, and this particular study is about tree crops in California, but we believe this has a broader implication, so that's why we're here today to talk about not only this particular study, but some empirical issues behind the question. So this study, we're just looking at almonds, walnuts, prunes, and wine grapes in California. And the reason this study has some value is that these tree crops, or broadly speaking, non-field crops, it is quite hard to think about or even estimate how the temperatures in different period of the season affect its outcome, namely yield or losses in that sense. And we took the advantage of using some cutting-edge empirical technique to identify which temperature at which period affect those multi-year crops. So I know that these crops are less common in Kansas, but the idea of thinking about this data science and variable selection to think about the crop outcomes and how that relate to temperatures in different period of the year, I believe that our stakeholders have some interest in it.
And to clarify, you're working with perennial crops here, so it's a year-round observation, which is
exactly
maybe hard to capture, so that's why you brought in Gyuhyeong to lend some statistical aid to this process. How did you go about the study and singling out, Gyuhyeong, that temperature factor?
One of my research interests is to serve the problem of variable selection. Here, variable selection means identifying influence factors or variables that could be related to the outcome of some event or phenomena. This study was motivated by Jisang's idea that we could use a variable selection method to identify weather variables that are particularly relevant to tree crops. So Jisang and I teamed up to answer the question that when and how temperature affect tree crops by applying a data-driven variable selection technique.
So that's the interesting and unique nugget to this. You used a specific data set here, Jisang, to address this?
Yeah, and I think the last time I was here talking to you, Eric, it was with Ed Perry, and we talked about other study with Jesse Tagg, Ed Perry, and myself, and that was probably the one of the first study that utilized this data, and so I kind of bridged out from that study and looking at this data. And this data set is from a crop insurance agency, with formerly Risk Management Agency of USDA. The nice thing about the federal crop insurance program is when you file for a claim that all the data are being recorded and aggregated to the county level by crop in a detail that we can analyze. And this cause of loss data, which actually disaggregate the losses into different causes, gave us an opportunity to think about how the temperature affect the crop losses. And namely, we're just focusing on here cold-related loss and heat-related loss because we think about temperature here. So in that sense, this is very valuable because now we before, if you use just regular yield data, you have a vague idea of, all right, high temperature could, have a detrimental effect on yield, but now we actually can see that how that contribute to heat loss. Same for cold, and which is more important for perennials because the freeze loss is quite important for those crops. So, long story short, that crop insurance cause of loss data is very valuable, and when we took the opportunity of using that data set.
And you also incorporated data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or
That's
NOAA,
correct.
for the weather numbers, so to say.
Exactly, yeah. So that's another data set that we actually start with that gridded temperature and precipitation data. We aggregate up to county level, and then we map that to the cause of loss data.
Well, Gyuhyeong, in analyzing that data set, this is rather challenging because of all the variables, you say.
Right. In our analysis, the main challenge was that we are dealing with many weather variables which move together. Including all of them in our model did not give us a clear answer on our question when and how temperature affect the crop losses. So we used a statistical technique, which is data-driven, to select relevant temperature variables. We apply this variable selection procedure to each crop because the temperature effects are different across the crops.
So it gives you an accurate concept of what's happening with those temperatures and those crops. Let's get right to your findings, for these are rather interesting. Jisang, what did you discover upon applying that approach to analyzing the data?
Yeah, no, the most interesting thing that we found, and it's in line with the literature, but rather thin literature, is that we find that cold weathers or freeze hours play more important role than hot weather, heating temperatures. Mm-hmm. That's different from crops that we see, right? Corn or soybeans or wheat or rice. Those crops, we had a good idea that the heat exposure is quite important and have a negative impact on that. But for these tree crops, the freezing temperature is actually more relevant and more important in terms of determining the losses. So that has two implications in a sense that when you think about warming temperature, that means that can lead to lower exposure to freezing hour. I'm not saying climate change, warming is a good thing, but if you look at the freeze loss only, we might see that loss gets reduced because of that. But at the same time, we do find some effect of the chill and heat hours. That means, again, hot weathers also have a detrimental effect on the tree crops as well. And I want to add one or two things to Gyuhyeong's point in a sense that the row crops, we do have more agronomic, more theoretical discussion on when and what temperature affects the outcome. The tree crops, it's hard, so that's why the data-driven way of thinking about when and what type of temperature affect the outcome is quite useful.
Mm-hmm. Let's then get more into the implications of this, having to do with the methodology as much as anything else here. Gyuhyeong, how do you perceive those implications?
I would like to highlight that data science can provide more insight for many different agronomy and agricultural economics questions. In particular, we see that data-driven variable selection technique can be used as a powerful tool. For example, we can further expand our model in this study to examine more complicated relationships, such as interactions between temperature and precipitation, or between weather variables and other characteristics, including time and locations.
So you can really mine into what's going on with those crops and those climate conditions. Jisang?
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, this particular study is about California and tree crops, but what I want to highlight is the way we think about this problem, right? The way we deal with the data, the way that we structure the empirical framework. And I think this somewhat data-driven, so-called big data or statistical learning technique can give us a more intuitions on how the climate or weather affect our food production in general. And that's applicable to Kansas as well. You know, Kansas, we do grow a lot of crops too, still can benefit from this approach because of the utilization of this data-driven technique and somewhat new type of data, which is from the crop insurance agency that's been underused but has a lot of information in it.
So your intent really is to do exactly that, apply this approach to the statistical analysis to crop production in Kansas and see what it tells you. Is that the next step?
Exactly, yeah. So we could look at different crops in Kansas, and also we can condition on the unique weather conditions or soil conditions or other environmental factors that Kansas is facing, and we can apply that in this framework as well. And then we can also give more ideas or more intuitions on how the crop production in Kansas should or has responded to climate change.
Well, thank you to the both of you for coming over, telling us about this, and looking forward to you further applying it in and analyzing how our crops respond to climatic conditions in a very precise analytical way. We appreciate you sharing this information right here.
Thank you very much for having us. Yeah.
What they've done is taken what is called data-driven variable selection techniques in statistical analysis to apply that to how crops respond to varying weather conditions as climate change is occurring. That's what makes this important for this day and age. From agricultural economics here at K-State, Jisang Yu, and from the Department of Statistics, Kansas State University, Gyuhyeong Goh. Our guests on this part of Agriculture Today. We'll be back with more here on the K-State Radio Network. We're back now on Agriculture Today, and time for our horticulture segment for this week. It's a continuation of a visit that we began last week with our guest, who is the Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent, Dennis Patton. What we're into here is successfully starting vegetable transplants from seed. And for those earlier planted vegetables, those starts should be established here very soon now. Dennis, we talked about the selection of seed. We talked about some of the other nuances, particularly with starting onions last time out. But let's look at the actual medium in which one would grow any vegetable transplant. Folks are often tempted simply to draw a sampling from their garden areas and plant in that medium, but that's not the way to go here, right?
That is correct. When we're growing transplants, we want to make sure we have clean, sterile media, what we call potting media, and usually that involves no garden soil. So most garden centers will sell a seed starting mix. They're very light, very airy, and they're all sterile, so that reduces the chances of damping off and other diseases. But they're the perfect medium for getting those seeds going, because really these plants are going to be growing in this soil for about 6 to 8 weeks before we put them out into our good garden soil. So yeah, we want to make sure we get a medium that's for transplants, seed starting.
Couple of standards required for transplant success, though. Moisture and adequate light. Speak to those, if you would, Dennis.
Yeah, germination or growing transplants is really kind of a two-phase. The first phase is getting them germinated. So once we get them planted, usually we like to put them in a warmer location where that soil's maybe up in the 70, 72 degree range. So people put them on a warm location. Some really diehard people put what they call a heat mat, a seed starting mat underneath them. Then once they're germinated and start coming through, that's the growth phase. And that's where light really becomes very important. A lot of diehard seed starters will do everything under lights. Like you can use fluorescent shop lights. Now they have all the LED fixtures that you can use. And the key to growing those transplants under light is you could leave them on for 15, 16, 18 hours a day, or 24/7 works too. And the other thing, you need to keep those light sources fairly close so you get that duration and intensity. So by close, I mean that LED fixture, that shop light may only be 3-4 inches above the top growth of the plant. So you want some sort of mechanism on a chain or a stand where you can raise and lower it as the plants grow. Because what you're really wanting to grow is that really short, stocky transplant. You don't want something that's kind of wimpy, going to blow in the wind, those type of things. And the way you do that is with good light, intensity, and duration. And if you go out to the Kansas Healthy Yards video page, there's a short video on creating a light stand using a fluorescent fixture out of PVC pipe that'll hold 2 to 3 pretty good sized flats, which you could probably easily get 50 to 100, 125 seedlings going under that, item will probably cost you $30, $40 or less and really help aid in your gardening.
And accompanying that would be managing the temperature in which those transplants are growing. What considerations come to the fore there?
Once you're past that germination stage, you can really go back to typical room temperatures. Most houses are, in the 68 to 72 range. That's going to be good for most plants. If it's really a warm location, they're going to really elongate, stretch out. A little bit cooler is going to slow them down. So maybe instead of taking 6 weeks to produce a transplant, it may take 8 weeks. That's why I recommend people that are starting seeds keep some good notes and records, because then you're going to know that in my location, it only takes me 6 weeks to grow a transplant because it's warmer, sunnier, as opposed to where it's cooler, it may take 8 weeks. And that way next year you can adjust back and forth to make sure you get a seedling that's ready to go to the garden when you're ready to go to the garden, not a week or two before or a week or two after.
Have some fun with it, gardeners, but once again, we're nearing the time, if not already there in the case of some vegetables, for starting those transplants from seed. Use all the resources from Research and Extension that can lend more guidance on this. Dennis, thank you, as always. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Eric.
Dennis Patton, horticulture agent for Johnson County, Northeast Kansas, on this week's horticulture segment. We appreciate you being along with us. Please rejoin us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.